So welcome, everybody. We're here to have what I'm sure is going to be a really stimulating conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Edward Iazatt, who is the commanding officer of what is known as the Disaster Assistance Response Team, and we'll learn more about that. This is in relationship to the earthquake that happened in Nepal last year on the 15th of April, 2015. A large 7.8 earthquake hit western and central regions in Nepal. There was also a subsequent second earthquake, killing over 8,000 people, injuring and displacing tens of thousands more. Canada was part of a global response to that event, offering support, relief efforts, and recovery efforts to Nepal. And part of Canada's response was the deployment of members of the DART team. So welcome, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Iazatt. I'll call you Ed from here on in. Welcome, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about DART and what it does and what it is.
So thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back at Royal Roads, certainly under sort of different programs. The DART itself is an ad hoc organization which often comes as a surprise to people. It's not a standing organization. The units itself exist around the country and are put together to meet the needs that are identified overseas. So there's not a DART unit per se. But when we are put together, it's an organization of anywhere between 200 and I'd say at the most 500 people, which consists of medics, engineers, logisticians, aircrew, and in this case, quite often focused around helicopters. And communications experts and liaison and command and control staff. We have the ability to deploy the team over a period of time, which I can talk about deployment timelines later if you wish, but we can gather within 48 hours and start our movement to wherever we need to in the world, and plenty of caveats depending on the scenario with wherever we need to go. When we're in theater, abbreviations here, theater, the affected nation. When we show up to an affected nation, we work for the head of mission, typically an ambassador, and we work to meet our government objectives in lockstep with the affected nation's leadership. So when I say our government objectives, what I mean by that is the head of mission will tell us what they would like to have achieved. And that's what we attempt to do, meeting what the disaster-struck nation's government has asked for. We deploy as a last resort or only resort, and that's one of the main things that needs to be understood, is that we're not the first resource of choice on the international stage, and I can say that for I'm going to say almost all militaries, but that will be our United Nations doctrine and policy that we attempt to adhere to. Is that we are the last resort.
And members of the DART team are all members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Do they volunteer for DART? Are they selected for DART? How does the DART unit, as it's put together, get comprised?
Well, not to correct you off the start, but we're not all military. Oh. I have the privilege of having on our team as Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada staff. So I have humanitarian advisory staff or capacity that's required for the mission, and policy advice as well. Part of the team could also include, I'm going to say, relationships with public safety guys, girls from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police if necessary. Now, back to the Canadian Forces side of things, we do have units that are earmarked, some on a rotational basis, some on a permanent basis, that are earmarked to go overseas. And what we do is we simply have these individuals put on standby and units on standby on an annual or biannual basis. We train together as required or as we can do throughout the year. And really it's up to our, and I'm going to use some military jargon, you can correct me, our force generating colleagues, commanders inside Canada to decide what units are tagged to go and be on high readiness. Because it's hard to be on high readiness at all times.
Right. And would that then the makeup of the team would be specific to the response that you're undertaking?
We have, as it were, a buffet, right, of choices. And so the land, sea, and air components will have different capabilities ready to go on different levels of readiness. So I could pull from engineers from Eastern Canada that could provide light engineering support. They could be the water purification guys, or they could be what we call construction engineers who are electricians, for example. So when we deploy to a disaster area, we decide whether or not, what niche that we can fill, if there are niches or general support requirements, and we pull those guys forward. Okay, so likewise with the Air Force, we never know if we'll need the Air Force right away, but they always get ready to go once the call is given, and everyone will be called forward in a very logical sequence. And the sequence is often driven by logistics and how it can be received and the deployment challenges that they'll face inside the zone.
So in the case of Nepal, and obviously I think probably most of us online and off, watch the news, know something of what happened in the quake, know how large an event it was. Can you sort of walk us through how you were called and when you were on the ground and the kinds of things that you were doing specifically in Nepal?
Well, okay, so we are always watching the disaster network, and not all humanitarian crises, I appreciate, arrive as a result of natural disasters, but I'll focus only on natural disasters. And we monitor a number of resources, but the simplest one is the United Nations OCHA's RUN website, which has a virtual operations room that tracks natural disasters around the world. So we're always listening.
I'm just going to stop you there because there's an acronym. Do you want to just explain what that is?
Virtual OSOC.
Yeah.
It's a virtual operations center.
Right.
So it's the United Nations common portrayal to the rest of the international community of what they understand is going on and how the operations are being run during and post-disaster. So a disaster will occur, an event will occur, and Global Affairs Canada will be asked to put together an interdepartmental task force. They're usually the lead. You'll see massive representation from across all departments at the federal level. They get together and decide whether or not, or assess whether or not Canada can respond and why they would respond. So there's a multidisciplinary interdepartmental approach to understanding the scenario as it develops. But while that's occurring, the Defense Department decides whether or not it will get the DART ready to go. We do this by layers of reconnaissance team. I'm one of the first to go with global affairs representatives that are usually a senior policy officer and humanitarian policy officers. We have other military representatives on the team, and we go to the affected nation or the area and assess whether or not Canada's response is welcome and in what capacity and how it could be used. I go specifically for the DART to see if it could be used and how it could be used. Within about 24 hours later, a reconnaissance team of about 20 would show up, ideally, and do the reconnaissance for, if we were to deploy, how we would do it, in fact, and check to see if it was feasible.
So this is quite a staged
Yes.
response. And how soon after the earthquake was, the first earthquake anyway, was April 15th. How soon would you be on the ground after that?
And 3 days is probably the shortest. Now, that's an earthquake, which you can't foresee.
Right.
But our government has pre-deployed our team for other events, to include cyclones in the Philippines. And so we've had assessment capabilities, if need be, pre-deployed to support that, so to shorten the timeline if necessary. Okay, we don't always go. The DART is, again, the last resort, and you'll often see assessment teams go without the military because it's not one of the options that Global Affairs Canada would be considering appropriate for the time. And let's keep in mind that the affected nation is the one who needs to call for the resource. There's one thing to call for funding or other assets. It's another thing to call for another nation's military to support. And so there's a little bit of a different approach.
Complications politically in there, yeah?
Diplomatically.
Yeah, yeah. So you've assessed in Nepal. There's a reconnaissance team that has followed you to do sort of deeper, broader assessment.
Right. So within about 3 days, they'll be on the ground, up and running. I will bring with them capability that can be effective immediately, if possible. So we have brought mobile medical teams that not only as they do the reconnaissance, but they can also provide primary care support as they arrive as well.
So in Nepal, maybe just walk us through what that looked like.
4 days into it, we had our medical teams go out and start not just defining the problem, but also delivering primary care and putting people into an evacuation system, okay, a national evacuation system. After that, our second aircraft that arrived, I'm sorry, I'm struggling for the order of march, as it were, is our term for the sequencing of the aircraft. But our next effect, yes, certainly was more medical and light engineering support. And what we had on the second and third aircraft, which arrive sort of every 3 or 4 days apart, and I'll explain the challenges of arrival, we used that as a priority to open up roads so that we could get not just our teams, but everyone's team out and in place. We also bring a command and control element and a liaison function that also helps define the problem and set up coordination structures, not just for ourselves, but clearly for any government or government region or the United Nations as required. So first in, a reconnaissance, usually with medical support. Second, medical and engineers, followed by or concurrent with that, command and control capability. Would it differ in other scenarios? Certainly. If I knew that for Nepal, for example, the helicopter support, we call it aviation support, we had come to an arrangement with potentially the British and the Americans, so we were not going to bring our own aircraft. We were going to use our relationships with the United Kingdom and the Americans. The United Kingdom in turn didn't have authority to bring in their aircraft, and that took a couple of weeks to decide. And unfortunately, the American U.S. Marines lost an aircraft, and so our concept of employment of our medical teams and our soldiers with the U.S. was shut down within a couple weeks as well.
So can you maybe paint a picture? There's sort of the abstract of this is what we do, but can you paint a picture of what you encountered when you first went and as this unfolded, what kinds of things you were encountering and sort of the flow of decisions that you were made as much as you can in that, to paint a picture for people of what that was like and what you were facing in that context?
There are two things. The first thing you'll receive is what's pushed out there centrally. And not to pick on USAID, but I do have memories of an assessment that was kicked out quickly that showed information as to what the disaster zone was going to look like. So you arrive inside the affected nation, and in this case Nepal, with a preconceived notion of what it could look like. So that's one thing. So outside information, assessed usually by outsiders, and lo and behold, it differs. And I'll explain that in a second. The next thing you realize when you hit the disasters, and this is the scope of the problems that we're dealing with, is you're going to deal with a nation in shock. And if you've ever been in your own, a vehicle accident, just multiply that by hundreds of times. So in Nepal, 8 million people affected. So you have a nation in shock. Dare I go back to Myanmar? Not that we were there, but imagine a country that had over 100,000 dead in 2008, and the UN, I think, has given numbers 200,000 dead. You have a nation that's in shock. It doesn't matter how well prepared you are, you're going to deal with an element of shock. And it's at varying levels, and it takes time to get through that. So you come in with misinformation, and you're going into an environment that's in shock. And what we have to deal with is defining the problem. The USAID's diagram, was thrown out before we hit the ground because it showed to us 80% destruction in downtown Kathmandu. Well, we knew that wasn't the case because you looked out the window and there wasn't 80% destruction. But to be fair to USAID, what there was 80% was the effect on the population, because the population was not in their buildings. It was all outside, and services had stopped. So even when we hit the when we landed at the airfield, commercial air and our military air, because the civilian team through Global Affairs comes in commercial or military, depends. In this case, we came in commercially through Delhi. There was an airport that was paralyzed.
What did that look like? What does a paralyzed airport look like?
Airplanes in the dark and in the rain with no one running things. So very few. So imagine, and maybe 5% effective. And that's in fairness after hours, so at night. And during the day, probably running at, and this is my opinion, so I apologize to Nepal if I'm wrong on the effectiveness, but probably about 20-25% effective. So instantly, you see that although there's no significant destruction to the region, you have a nation that is paralyzed for a bunch of really good reasons. And then you have to get past that to understand where the life-saving needs to occur.
So you've arrived at the airport. The airport is paralyzed in some effect, and you're also looking at destruction that may or may not match the reports.
Right.
So then what?
Our job is to link in with all of the leaders who are going to make the decisions, and under what authority. So in this case, it was to link up with, for ourselves, the military leadership, while our policy colleagues found the civil leadership, and they did that with our global affairs crew that had come in, not just from Canada, but of course from the mission in Delhi. So concurrently that occurs, and we have a team that goes off and talks to the United Nations representatives who are there and other NGOs. I would argue that if there was any other Canadians there, we would have worked on any other development, any other link into the country, the team would have checked on. Then it's a matter of problem definition, and if Canada were to come, how would it help? And that's from the DART perspective. Prod me as to where we need to go on this one.
So in relationship to that, in the specifics of Nepal, using that as a very concrete example, what kinds of things were you seeing that prompted you to think, okay, we need to go another step?
We have good relationships through our former training opportunities with the Nepalese military. So once we had walked through the offices of the Nepalese leadership, we did run into individuals that we had worked with before. And
some existing relationships.
Yes, and I just have to smile. It was fantastic. They were the individuals who knew how we operate,
right,
knew how we could operate, and said, hey, you could be used here, here, and here. And then we just had to check to see if it was logistically feasible, and all of the small things that go with the deployment. And so as a result of relationships that had been put in place before, that's what we would do. That's how we actually cracked the code in this one in terms of focusing our efforts right away. So set the priority loads for the aircraft coming in. Would that work in most nations? Sure. Need we have great relationships? No, because the United Nations has, in many countries, helped them prepare a liaison function to receive military capabilities and help us narrow our reconnaissance when we hit. So we should be able to walk into many an affected nation, explain who we are and why we're there, because we should be their request, and they'll tell us where we have to go, where they would like us to go, and prioritize our effort. We show up during the relief phase, not during the rescue phase. The rescue phase is a little bit different, and it's led by the first rescuer on the ground, international, if the affected nation can't do it. In this case, Nepal didn't have a significant search and rescue capability, or was overwhelmed. And I think it was a Dutch lead. So we linked in with the Dutch lead to understand how we were going to transition out of search and rescue into the relief phase. Okay?
So the decision is made, in the case of Nepal, the decision is made, yes, there is a way for us to contribute in this context, and you've got some relationships. So what then? Where, as the rest of the team arrives?
In this case, what we had received was a request by the Nepalese government to push out into the Sindapalchak region, out towards a town of Sharakat and Shachura. And for time and space, I know this is going nationally, but I'll try to make it local for you. That's the equivalent of us arriving downtown Victoria,
right,
appreciating your airports elsewhere, and being asked to look at problems in Comox at a 3-hour mark and push our effect out to the 9-hour mark. And I say 9, I mean that's at best ground transportation.
Right.
If you've ever looked at Nepal, the challenges are immense in terms of moving on the roads. I mean, their major highways are significantly degraded during an earthquake or even during a monsoon season. It's tough. So we were asked to push into Sindapalchak, and we did. Could we reach the town of Sharakat? No, we couldn't. But what we could do is influence the operations, the domestic operations for the affected nations of the Nepalese out in that direction. When we headed out that direction, there's 2 governors that were at play. One east, one west, as it were. We had to go through the western governor in order to reach the eastern governor, and we had to deal with those diplomatic challenges of who was going to get the resources and why. That's not an uncomfortable experience, but that is one that we can always expect going into a disaster, is the competition for resources. At the 2-week mark, and this is where we had the flow of capability, and I said engineers, communications, and just general soldiers to provide the support and support our mobile medical teams as we pushed out into the region.
And sorry, just about how many people are you?
We capped this one at 200.
Okay.
Okay, so we were full strength. We were 200, maybe 205 people. At the 2-week mark, we had realized that our criteria for transition, which is the handover of work tasks, if we don't complete them, to the affected nation or non-government organizations, we had gone beyond their reach. So we pulled back into the Kathmandu Valley, which we were working all the time in concert, in parallel, because I thought we had gone too far.
And when you say you've gone too far, tell me a bit more about what you mean by that.
With the mission, our mission statement, the duration of our mission for the relief part is somewhere between 40 and 60 days. So within that time frame, our job is to hand over, and we have to set up conditions for that to occur. And we were struggling at times to find that. Okay, so at some point, there's a degree of futility if you're going to go and say, well, this needs help. Our assessment teams that do a wonderful job of defining the problem, after 14 days, we had assessed with a fair degree of certainty what the scope of the problem was out to the 6-9 hour mark. We didn't need to go and visit. What we needed to do is be able to support those who were going to go out. And what we found is that those individuals, those organizations, and the government wasn't going to push out to the scope that they needed us to help that transition.
So there's really that sense of wanting something to be sustainable after you leave.
Yes.
Not just initiating something and having it dissolve once you exit.
However, sometimes it's a matter of approach. In this case, it was. We switched directions and came out with a stronger, let's say, springboard out of the Kathmandu Valley using the town of Sanku. Whereas that, distance-wise, it's merely as far as it were, Sydney. So it's quite close, but it was a good enough springboard to push ideas and people out further. So confidence is important. In Sanku, we had started to work very cooperatively with the Nepalese military, the Nepalese police, that's armed and unarmed police, I'll say, my interpretation, municipal services, and NGOs, because it was close to Kathmandu. It became a good example of coordination and cooperation. And when Sanku was opened, and that's just the main routes through this 16th century town, we were able to approach from the west to solve the problem that we could not solve earlier. So we were able to push out further as a result of coming out with a better springboard. Does that make sense without showing you a map? The other brilliant piece of work is what we had discovered in the first 2 weeks is the concept of property was an issue. And people in shock need to have faith in their centralized government or a governance system. And we had people who were very worried about losing their property.
Right.
And that was both physically the rubble that they had and the terrain that they were on. So our lawyer put together a beautiful document and encouraged the Nepalese to use it. And really this document said, I am, appropriately, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, please government, remove my rubble, look after it while I rebuild. So surveys of the ground, survey of the rubble. So putting in a procedure that you ask the government to move your stuff, because the concept of property is different there. We did this initially out on the eastern side of Kathmandu because we needed to open a bridge. And the only reason why we couldn't open a bridge is because there was a husband and wife who didn't want to have the rubble removed. And so it took a couple of days, but we got the permission with a legal document produced by the government of Nepal, or the local governor, and moved the property.
And a strong sense of working with, right? You're working with both the Nepalese government, but also the affected people, and really wanting to do things in a way that support their capacity and their norms or their orientation to what's going on.
Yeah, once people see that you're doing the work that they could do, they'll do it. And so the Nepalese people are wonderfully resilient individuals and collectively phenomenal. And when they saw our soldiers going down roads to see their houses and making pathways, boy, it was hours later, things were moving. And it was, again, a degree of confidence. That confidence piece, beautiful hospital in downtown Kathmandu, albeit private, and there's other, I'm going to say, government or public ones. So there are two different types of institutions there, but all empty. All of the work was being done essentially in parking lots. So a beautiful 13-story, state-of-the-art infrastructure not being used because people wouldn't go in. Yeah. So, we would go in, and bit by bit, they would see foreign uniforms go in, so not just our own. Foreign NGOs go in as well, and the community where we believed it was safe started getting the infrastructure going. So the confidence piece is very important.
I have other questions, but I also want to, see if there are questions that any of you or anyone online has at this point. Are there questions that you have about anything that's been said, or yeah?
You talked about competition for resources on the ground. How do you navigate that?
I should probably have done the give you. So maybe I'll ask you to ask. Oops. Robin, I can do it. Okay, thanks.
I'm going to say, sorry, go ahead, ask
I'll
your question again.
repeat the question. How do you navigate the competition for resources on the ground?
I can give in this case, but then I'll explain the layers of staff that I have who are sensitive towards all of those challenges. So let's be clear. When I show up and say the DART can do it, it is with a view to having ensured that we have a degree of certainty in terms of suppliers and Resources available. Because injecting resources money or otherwise, there's a plus or minus. So we have to assess that quickly as well. So one of the criteria for entry into the affected nation is to ensure that we have the resources we need. Fuel, aviation-wise, is a significant issue. I know I have a pilot in the room, but I think of the Nepalese government. I have said that the airport had, was 25% efficiency. I think that what I heard anecdotally was that over those few months, that was 10 years worth of fuel supply is what had gone through. Now, there's a plus and minus there. How's that fuel coming in? Where's it coming in from? And you've got to look at the supply chain there. And then who benefits when we buy fuel in certain places. Then this is not for 1 minute to suggest that this is what the Nepalese government was doing to us or the airport authorities, but we also listen to how heavy can our airplanes land? And sometimes it'll be kind of nice to land in an airport, and again, I have a pilot here who could probably speak better to this, land with as much fuel as you can so you can fly home rather than fill up. There are times that that's convenient, but if you wanted to profit from the operation, it would be, well, hey, you can only land at this weight, knowing full well you have to refuel. And so you have to be sensitive to all of those. So I'm trying to explain how we navigate those challenges. And so navigate even the delivery of resources. If it is only by air, and it's not only by air, I mean, there's land routes in, and you could probably brief me better on the land route challenges between the supporting nations of China and India. But the three competing, and this is an oversimplification of the competing priorities of the airport, but you have humanitarian assistance coming in, you have people who want to leave. You have brothers and husbands trying to return because of a lack of information, or maybe they should stay in a foreign country and make money to help. Bit of a dilemma there. And then you have tourism, which is a significant source of funds. What of the three do you prioritize? Well, they're all priority, depending on who you are. And so you have to work through that to understand your air logistics challenges. I can say that of probably any resource and any commodity, even prioritization on routes, you'll have those competing interests. Does that help answer your question? I bring a pretty healthy staff. There's an I in there. The more staff we have, the better we usually are, because I'll quote OCHA, the Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Coordination saves lives. And sometimes it's better to have someone who can coordinate because the resource is already there, or we need to send something with more precision to a location or not to a location. And so I have the privilege of having a team that is well-staffed and has good reach back to Canada and other nations. Okay.
Questions from people joining us on live stream. And the first is from Michelle Sullivan. And she asks, did aftershocks affect the two cities and their vulnerable populations differently?
Okay, let's confirm which two cities. Are we talking the two different, I suppose, is she still online? The two cities.
Probably, maybe where you were
Yeah, because I made
deployed.
reference to Chowchura and Sherikot.
Yeah.
Yes. As it happens, on the 12th of May, the town of Chowchura was leveled. And the United Nations had a centralized node there. And it's a linear town along a road on the peak of a mountain or hill. And so for the relief, the rescue phase was back on, but for relief and recovery, the question would be, how could we have helped at that point? Because the odds of us influencing the total destruction made our impact negligible at that point. That the town was destroyed. There was nothing really left of it, and the UN was cut off on the hill. Sherikot fared better on the 12th. So the town in the east did well. The town in the west did not. there. Hopefully that answers the question. Does anyone have any? Good enough? I'm not sure that I always finish my thoughts, let alone my sentences. So if I don't,
okay.
please, I won't take offended.
We have another question from
Yeah.
online. And can you
Another
just-
question from this one from Madison Elias. How do the humanitarian policy officers play a role, and what do their responsibilities include?
So these individuals are from Global Affairs Canada. They can, I can say they can come from anywhere in the world. My policy advisor was the deputy head of mission from Serbia, but he and was sprung over to help us. There's two sides: the policy individual and the humanitarian individual, and they can be more than one. So they're two functional areas. The humanitarian advisor links in with the humanitarian architecture that's there. So we'll link into the OCHA, their cluster system that gets established, and is responsible to me to advise on all humanitarian issues. So as we are operating to ensure that we have the facts and the advice relative to the humanitarian aspects of the operation, the policy individual or individuals help me on the governance side, both internal to the country and then with the relationships with Global Affairs Canada and the head of mission. During the early stages in Nepal, for example, we did a personnel evacuation program. The head of mission wasn't on the ground yet, and we had to have a good relationship with our colleagues from Global Affairs in the time, DFAT-D, to do the evacuation. Okay, so that's what the policy officer will do: link into national affected nation leadership, and where appropriate. So we'll link in appropriately with our head of mission, keeping in mind we didn't have an embassy or consular. We had an honorary consul in Nepal, so we didn't have sort of an institutional global affairs piece there, and it had to be built en route. But did we have relationships with the nation? Certainly we did. I mean, I had trained with the Nepalese officers throughout my career, courtesy of a relationship that had been established through foreign affairs. Okay.
Other questions? I'm curious about, I want to ask you about success and challenges, and maybe this will fit in, but you talked about some choices that you made, that the team made in response to whether there was capacity to carry forward the work that you were doing after you left. So how is that monitored? So post your deployment, you've returned to Canada. What kinds of connections or follow-up is there to see how those kinds of initiatives are moving forward, or is there any?
The Defense Department, I'm going to say to my knowledge, the DART does not. That's for sure. Do we still professionally watch? Sure,
Yeah.
we do. And I've explained that we had colleagues who we had trained, and so we do keep in touch with them. And people come out of the woodwork. I can talk about U of T professors who had worked near the Sanku region, Guelph University in terms of ideas for support to an agricultural piece. Manitoba Hydro, who I think was involved in power generation work. Engineers Without Borders out of Quebec, who were going into, again, inside the Kathmandu Valley to rebuild 90 houses and schools. When I say rebuild, new build. Will we support them professionally, as I would with anybody here, if it's within my purview, to pass on professionally what we had learned, then we will pass it on. Otherwise, it all rests with our regional head of mission, whoever covers it, which is our embassy that's in India, in Delhi. And so it's their job to maintain that contact. Will Kathmandu face another earthquake? It certainly will. It's inevitable, and they know that.
Yeah. In the context of Nepal, and maybe I don't know if there are things that were unique about that environment. I'm sure there are always things that are unique culturally and in terms of the event, but I know DART has responded in other contexts. Are there some significant successes and or challenges that you met in that context that would sort of be illuminating to hear about?
I think one of the what was interesting to see is how is there, you know, I will throw this out sort of back as a question. One of the questions I have is there donor fatigue, and where's the main effort? Because the challenges for the NGOs, you know, if the militaries are the last resort, with an effective nation that's in shock, this band of support from the NGOs, you know, how strong is it, and how can it get there? And I think the more remote the location, certainly the more challenging it's going to be. And Nepal is remote, and I think was that a success? I think it's a matter of fact, and I can only wish that there was enough resources to go around to meet all of the challenges. But I'll leave it there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it does partially, but is there a story that sort of signifies for you one of the successes? I'm sure there were many of DART on the ground in that context. Is there a story that you can recall personally in your role or with your team where it's like, yeah, that really encapsulates something we're very proud of?
I think there is not one thing that I'm not proud of. I think the only disappointment I have was hey, did we hand over as well as we could have? So the rest of the operations, whether it be even the lawyer and his beautiful paperwork that helped the concept of property move forward, the mobile medical teams, yes, there was more casualties than the evacuation system could handle, certainly on the 12th and afterwards, but we ran a brilliant triage, and later they were commended for it, but frankly, it's expected of them. Right. They were doing their job. The Nepalese asked us to train their medics on how we do triage and how we run basic medical care during a crisis. And so after the 12th of May, sometimes afterward, we help teach their military and civilians as well. Very, very subtly, we supported the evolution of operations at the airfield. And it's quiet, it's silent in our approach, but that's how people would like us to be. So I'll talk about the OCHA doctrine, and they see three levels of support. Organization for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They say cookie, truck, bridge. Cookie being direct support. Truck being indirect support. Yeah, you could probably pull that slide up, Jeff. And infrastructure support for the bridge. What we're asked to do is provide indirect support. So it's not front and center. So even our geomatic support, our georeferencing, where it is on a map, helping people define the problem was incredibly useful. And so the Master Corporal, who were part of the team that helped georeference the stuff, absolutely brilliant. Our civil coordination liaison teams that were out there, I know they came up with numerous camp designs if camps were going to be built. Well, okay, I know a lot of them didn't get built because the tentage didn't show up, and the distribution and how they chose to do things didn't come to fruition, but they did some brilliant work. So that supported the objectives of IOM, the International Organization for Migration, so the United Nations organization that helps the movement of refugees and the housing of refugees, and then on to UNHCR. So IOM, so absolutely brilliant work. And then just frankly, the average soldier. The average soldier that I brought that would get out there and with courage walk through with the right calculus in terms of risk assessment, an urban environment that would then spark the motivation of others to follow was absolutely brilliant. So our engineers, I'll never forget the light piece of equipment that we were using, which was not inadequate for the job, But when you look at the magnitude of the job, certainly couldn't be done. But I tell you, a week later, heavy equipment from the Nepalese government and local contractors were showing up because they saw what could be done. So yeah, our little green backhoe did something, but it started opening routes. Yeah, and how do I put it in context? The officer wandering around on that was a man who was missing a leg and had a prosthesis on. So here he was out there getting on with work. Yeah, okay, he had a prosthetic leg on that no one in Nepal would probably have the privilege of having their limb replaced by. But that was phenomenal. We provided, one of the things that we did donate, because I couldn't bring it back, is we donated a hospital shelter. Remember I said everyone was outside. So I had a command post. I didn't set it up because we had challenges in terms of getting permission to set up tentage. So our tent was set up to support a hospital. And I couldn't bring it back, it was covered in blood. But it was, our team had set that tentage up that became a 4-patient operating room at an orthopedic hospital. It was phenomenal. Wow. So the simple use of the tent, the power generation, no longer were they operating in a parking lot. Okay, it was a tent in a parking lot, and it was incredibly hot, but it was just phenomenal that way. Yeah, I'll also add that the people there, I never heard, well, this is not true, but I never heard anyone cry. I heard 2 cry, and they were children looking for milk from their mother, and that's it. No one cried. Phenomenally, I'll use the word stoic if that's the right word, but no one cried. There, is that, so proud? Everyone, it was great. Was there embarrassing moments? I can't remember any.
Or any you're willing to share, no.
No, I'm trying, yeah, we had, so, yeah, you can't bring heavy equipment in that can't go down the roads, or, yeah, so there are times where, there's a degree of frustration, why can't we do it? Well, you can't, it just physically can't be done. So, yeah, those frustrating things, no, they're not embarrassing. You can't use the equipment, so you switch it to a different area of focus. I'd love to have helped the World Food Program move aid forward. That would have been direct support, but no, it wasn't going to happen. Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah, Jean.
Thank you. I'm curious about, you talked about DART being a flexible organization.
Did I use the word flexible? Because I don't like the word flexible. Okay. I prefer the word versatile.
Okay, versatile.
Because, and the subtle difference being, I like the crew to be good at what they can do, because some things they can't do. And once they're good at it, be able to switch between tasks. So I don't like the annoying gray area in between. Is that fair between my interpretation of
That's
versatility
fair.
and flexibility?
Yeah, okay, so being a versatile organization.
Thanks.
When you look at this DART experience compared to others, and you think about what you take away from the experience in Nepal, is there anything about the Nepalese experience with DART that will improve, adapt, change future DART responses? Is there anything that you learned in this response that might shape things going forward?
Every opportunity to deploy and train, we learn. That's it. But there's nothing that we weren't ready for, or not that we were rehearsed in. So one of the things that we weren't rehearsed in was not having an embassy to talk to right away. So there's, say, 48 hours of airtime where there's not the strong guidance from Global Affairs Canada. Not that we needed it, because we had this concept of mission command. Our training, whether it be for disaster response or the other training that we do for our full spectrum operations, holds us in good stead. I am confident with what we have done. Prior to that, I had just run a very boring logistics table talk exercise, proving things could or couldn't be done. It was brilliant. And that's the crew that was working with me, not me. We had just finished working down in Jamaica, where we actually realized we should run a logistics tabletop exercise because some things weren't as smooth as they ought to have been. And frankly, we failed in some areas, but we pushed it to failure. So sort of in private, we pushed to failure. I will push to failure on an exercise about 2 weeks from now in Trenton. And we'll find, not with the air crew, but they will be involved. No, because there's a calculus associated with what fails and what doesn't fail. So no, and the individual who is with me as a mentor in Jamaica was Lieutenant Colonel retired Mike Voith, who was the DART commander for Sri Lanka and then Pakistan, so the tsunami and the earthquake. So we understand that we have to go back to our lessons learned and after action review process, and we have such a high turnover rate of people. But with a common understanding, as long as we keep people poised and ready to go, as long as people understand what ready means and what the environment it could be, no, I think Nepal was a case in point of, yeah, this is what we can do. Okay, and at times this is what we can't do. What I didn't tell you is there were times where we went and pushed to the Gorkha region. Politically, it was tough, I use the word politically, but I couldn't find myself closing a gap with the Indian operation that was going on. It wasn't going to work as an ally, and I need to understand how to work as an ally alongside another military nation. Yet I had no troubles in terms of interpreting Chinese intent in where we ended up going. But I also was working on terrain that I knew that we couldn't operate incredibly effectively in that other region where the Indians were doing a lot of things with helicopter support. So hopefully that answers your question. And our leadership allows us to do that training. That is an interdepartmental training as well. I will have next couple weeks from now, I'm training with the next team that could go with the interdepartmental strategic assessment team, the global affairs team that goes and does initial assessments. Our civilian colleagues who need to walk into a disaster zone as well. For some of them, it's a challenge to even understand what it means to walk into a disaster and try to look after yourself at the same time you're doing your work. Right? Tough. Is that okay?
Other questions online or in presence? So do you have one? Sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm just wondering, I know there was a large youth response that was really facilitated by social media, and I'm wondering how often, if ever, when you're working with civilians, are you working mostly through organizations, or are you working kind of with grassroots kind of groups that emerge after disasters, or how does that sort of on-the-ground collaboration happen?
So I'd like to say I cast the web wide and deep. So I have, again, this incredible staff that we have. And the depth depends on where we see things that need to be exploited or shielded. But we watch back in Canada, the matching fund. We anticipate how our humanitarian advisor and the head of mission will help support those funds be dispersed in the affected nation or the region afterwards. Do we know the answers? No, but we can only anticipate. In terms of then, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, the largest Save the Children mission is in Nepal, I believe. So we know where their emphasis is. We understand the exploitation that can occur during a crisis. And we can talk about the challenges of human trafficking. Youth there. I think the motivated youth were foreign motivated youth. They're the ones who came to realize that things had to be done. One sort of donor that we worked with was French youth, probably 18 years old, maybe at the high end 2022. But French students who got money, bought rice, rented trucks, and pushed stuff forward. But the youth inside a village, different. The culture is very different. I think you jump from being a child to an adult overnight there, and I think the earthquake or such a disaster sometimes forces that a little bit quicker than you'd want. But the youth that was working there, now you were either a child helping your mother or father at home on the farm, or doing something to keep the school clean if the school was left there, or you were working. Okay, and if you were of working age male, a lot of those were elsewhere, either in the country or out of country. So I didn't see a large youth movement there. Okay, so that can give you youth parameters. That's what I saw in the corner of the world that we were at.
Maybe as a way of wrapping up, because we're just about out of time, you know, we're in the context, certainly within our program, Disaster and Emergency Management program here at Royal Roads, and in other conversations in this field, talking about looking forward and climate change and increasing frequency and magnitude of disasters potentially, and you know, a future that's going to have a lot of challenges. And I'm just wondering, based on your experience and as you think about DART and Canada's response nationally and internationally, what insights or thoughts you have as we sort of look forward to that landscape?
I'll give you two things.
Okay.
I'll do the difficult one last, but I'll do the easy one first then. I'll use a military term. The littoral environment.
The what?
The littoral environment.
The littoral environment, and what does that mean?
So what we're concerned about is populations at risk along the shorelines. Okay, so is climate change going to affect that? Your students and yourself could brief me better on that fact. It's your work that I would turn to say, hey, the risk is changing. So certainly we know there's increased risk along deltas, estuaries, or anyone who's along the coast. Now define the coast and define elevation levels, and that all changes. So what that has done for me is reinforced our requirement to have mobility, the ability to move beyond using ground-based assets, so vehicles, if you can't drive there. So what do we do? So my relationship, and I'm going to point to my Air Force colleague, the relationship with our helicopters and tightening our procedures up. So logistics resupply, personnel movement will look that way. Can we do it? Sure, we can do it. But can we always be better? Yep. Do crews always need to be trained and be current? Yep. And that's not just the crew on the aircraft who are current, but can my ground crews work with them? Loading a slung load aircraft, a sling that goes beneath the helicopter, you don't just wake up in the morning and say, I can do that. You need to train people to do that, and you need to identify those people. And so that's what we're doing. So we're getting ready to provide a more versatile response and say that's what we can do. And that all goes back to procurement. Do you then have to buy the slings? And some of them are biodegradable, all of that sort of thing. So, and I will do that, and we'll do that also with our maritime, our Navy, and the small boat operations. Can we expand it to other surveillance assets to support that sort of thing? Sure, and so that's what we'll investigate. So as we maintain our capabilities, Norm, push out that way, okay?
And the challenging?
The challenging one, I can go back to the Canadian Humanitarian Conference in, I think it was 2013, that we held in Ottawa. And it was front and center, and it's the challenges of complex emergencies. So I've talked about the employment of militaries inside a natural disaster using the Oslo guidelines that the United Nations has cooperatively put together, that many nations are signatories to. But complex emergencies and the use of military assets in humanitarian environments, humanitarian crisis, so not necessarily a disaster, it depends on how you want to define its creation, that is complicated. And the scale moves that way, and as the conference pointed out, in many cases is well over there. So what do I mean by complex? Yeah, all-out complexity is messy wars with humanitarian challenges. That's not what DART's designed for, but that is where the humanitarians look, and that's where their challenging operating environment is. Okay, so complex emergencies and littoral.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking this time to share with us your insights specific to Nepal and also about DART. It's a real privilege to have had you join us here and to have shared that information with us. And I'm sure that if there are questions that emerge, we can pass those along and hopefully get some answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good.